Have you ever wondered what sets bourbon apart from Scotch? Maybe you're curious about what they have in common. I've done the hard work of researching and tasting bourbon and Scotch to answer these questions for you. Today, we're diving into the world of these two iconic spirits. Stick around because by the end of this video, you'll be a bourbon and Scotch connoisseur. I'm Robert Moore. Welcome to School of Wine and Spirits. We're comparing two of the most beloved whiskeys in the world, bourbon and Scotch. We'll break down their similarities, differences, and even taste a few to see how they stack up. Bourbon and Scotch are often mentioned in the same breath, but they have distinct characteristics that set them apart. Whether you're new to the world of whiskey or a seasoned connoisseur, understanding these differences can enhance your appreciation and enjoyment. Let's start with the basics. Bourbon is an American whiskey primarily made from corn and must be aged in new charred oak barrels. Scotch, on the other hand, is made in Scotland primarily from cereal grains, typically malted barley, and can be aged in used oak barrels. These fundamental differences in ingredients and aging processes create distinct flavor profiles. We'll dive into some tasting notes and more specifically discuss the legal requirements that define these two famous beverages. First, let's talk about whiskey with an E and without an E. The different spellings originated in the early 1800s when Ireland wanted to differentiate its Irish whiskey from Scotch. A general rule of thumb is if the country's name includes an E, then they spell whiskey with an E. United States, whiskey with an E. Ireland, whiskey with an E. Scotland, whiskey, no E. Japan, no E. It is just a general rule of thumb. Maker's Mark and Old Forester spell whiskey without an E as an homage to their heritage. So what is whiskey? The legal requirements to be designated a whiskey are as follows. It must be made from grain. It must be distilled to less than 190 proof. It must be matured in an oak barrel, and it must be bottled at 80 proof or higher. This is U.S. law, but it helps to understand the nature of the spirits. We're going to review 4 whiskeys today. Jim Beam White Label Bourbon, the Macallan 12-year single malt Scotch, Maker's Mark Bourbon, and Laphroaig 10-year single malt Scotch. All right, let's talk about bourbon first. First up is Jim Beam White Label, one of, if not the most successful bourbon on the planet. This is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. I know you're asking, what does that mean? Let's talk about the legal requirements of bourbon. This is going to get a bit techno, but bear with me. It's good info and it'll only take a minute. The legal definition of bourbon is cataloged in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 27, or the CFR. The legal definition requires that it must be made from at least 51% corn, it must be distilled at 160 proof or less, it must be barreled at 125 proof or less, it must be matured in a new charred oak barrel, and it must be free from added substances. You can add 2 things, water and more bourbon. It must be bottled at 80 proof or higher, and it must be produced in the United States of America and its territories. Can it be produced in Guam or Puerto Rico? Yes. Okay, so what's Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, you ask? In order to be a Kentucky bourbon whiskey, it must meet all of the requirements to be a bourbon whiskey and be produced in Kentucky and aged in Kentucky for at least 1 year. In order to be designated a straight bourbon whiskey, it must meet all of the requirements to be a bourbon whiskey, and it must be aged for at least 2 years. If you want to know more about bourbon, pick up a copy of my book, America's Spirit, A History of Bourbon. It's on Amazon. Grab a copy. Okay, back to Jim Beam White Label. This journeyman of a whiskey is a smooth and mellow example of the genre, known for its classic taste and affordability. It's a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey made by the Jim Beam Distilling Company, a subsidiary of Suntory Global Spirits, at the Jim Beam Distillery in Claremont, Kentucky. It's 80 proof and is aged at least 4 years. The mash bill is 77% corn, 13% rye, and 10% malted barley, and the aged spirit is a light gold color. At an MSRP of $15 to $20 a bottle, this is an affordable option for any bar. The nose gives us light caramel and vanilla notes with hints of corn and a touch of fruit. The palate reveals sweet caramel and vanilla flavors with a subtle presence of oak and peanuts. The finish is medium long, smooth and mellow, and it features lingering notes of corn and vanilla. Overall, Jim Beam White Label is a smooth and mellow bourbon, known for its classic flavor and affordability. This is just a rock-solid bourbon that you can serve any beginner or seasoned whiskey drinker. Now, let's compare that to the Macallan 12-year-old Scotch whiskey. This is a great whiskey that's matured in select sherry casks from Jerez, Spain. It's a single malt Scotch whiskey. More on that in a minute. It is made by the Macallan Distillers Limited, a subsidiary of Edrington, at the Macallan Distillery in Speyside, Scotland. At 83 proof, this is distilled in pot stills and aged for 12 years in those sherry casks I mentioned. Because the climate is much more mild in Scotland and they typically barrel their whiskey in used casks, it takes longer for Scotch to mature than in Kentucky, where the temperatures vary much more widely from season to season. The mash bill is 100% malted barley, and the aged spirit is a rich gold color. The MSRP varies by market, but generally runs about $65. The nose has aromas of dried fruit, sherry, and vanilla, with hints of butterscotch and spiced plums. The palate is sweet and full-bodied with flavors of sherry, plums, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a touch of oak. The finish is medium-long with lingering notes of sweet cherry, oak, and mild spiciness. This is a well-balanced and approachable single malt that serves as an excellent introduction to the world of Scotch whiskey. Its rich sherry influence and smooth profile make it a favorite among newcomers and seasoned whiskey drinkers. Maybe not the most complex Scotch, but its consistent quality and inviting flavors make it a reliable choice for any occasion. Coming back to the term single malt Scotch, there are several types of Scotch. This gets a little deep, but if you're at all interested in expanding into Scotch, here it is. First, let's define Scotch whiskey. The legal requirements to be designated as Scotch whiskey are as follows. It must be produced in Scotland. It must be made from cereal grains, those that grow on the end of grass like corn, wheat, millet, etc. Its sugar conversion must use natural enzymes from malted barley. What this means is that you cannot use artificial enzymes to break down the starches in the mash into fermentable sugars. Other countries allow the use of artificial enzymes, including the U.S., in the production process. It cannot be distilled to higher than 189.6 proof, but most distillers never get near that proof, as the higher you go, the more flavor you're stripping away. It cannot be matured in casks larger than 700 liters or 185 gallons. The standard barrel used in the production of bourbon is 53 gallons. It must be aged in Scotland in oak for at least 3 years. Finally, it mustn't contain any added substances, but it can contain caramel coloring. All right. Now let's get deep in the weeds. Getting back to single malt Scotch, there are several types of Scotch. You have single malt Scotch that must be made from only water and malted barley, and only at one distillery in pot stills. Single grain Scotch is distilled in column stills and must be made at a single distillery with multiple grains, malted or unmalted, with only water and malted barley. The term single actually refers to the single distillery in these two instances, not the mash bill. Blended malt whiskey is a blend of two or more single malt whiskeys from different distilleries. Blended grain Scotch is a blend of two or more single grain Scotches from different distilleries. Then, blended Scotch whiskey is a blend of all of the above. It can be confusing, but the Scotch craze really focused on single malt Scotch back in the day. Now, companies like Compass Box are releasing grain Scotch that has tremendous and varied flavor profiles. If you're curious, you should check them out. On to our next bourbon, Maker's Mark. This is known for its smooth and approachable flavor profile. Crafted with a unique mash bill featuring red winter wheat instead of rye, it offers a distinctive sweetness and balance that sets it apart from traditional bourbons. A Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, it is produced by Suntory Global Spirits at the Maker's Mark Distillery in Loretto, Kentucky. At 90 proof, this bourbon has no age statement, but the whiskey is aged 6 to 7 years before bottling. The mash bill is 70% corn, 16% wheat, 14% malted barley, and the aged spirit exhibits a deep amber color. The MSRP varies by market, but is generally around $30 to $40 a bottle. It gives a nose of sweet vanilla, caramel, and red fruit with a hint of oak. The palate is smooth and balanced with flavors of vanilla, caramel, and oak. The medium-long finish gives notes of vanilla, oak, and a gentle sweetness. This is a classic bourbon known for its smooth and approachable character. It's characterized by its signature red wax-dipped bottle, and it's a popular choice for beginners and experienced whiskey drinkers. Now we're going to get to a knuckle-dragger of a Scotch whiskey. Laphroaig 10-year is a single peated malt Scotch, which means that the malted barley was germinated, then dried using peat as the fuel. By drying the malted barley using peat, it infuses the malt with a unique smoky flavor that greatly influences the taste of the final product. This is not a starter Scotch, unless you love smoke like my wife. That it is. Let's break it down. As I said, Laphroaig 10-year is a single malt Scotch produced at Suntory Global Spirits and distilled at the Laphroaig Distillery in the Isle of Islay, Scotland. It is 86 proof and aged for 10 years in a combination of barrels to deliver the final flavor profile. The mash bill is 100% malted barley, as we remember from the single malt designation. The final aged spirit is a golden amber color, and the MSRP is around $60 a bottle. On the nose, you get peat smoke, seaweed, and a medicinal essence, with hints of sweetness. The palate delivers surprising sweetness with layers of peatiness, salt, and a touch of oak. The long and lingering finish gives us a sweet seaweed afterglow. You might be asking yourselves, why the hell would you drink that? You'd be surprised how quickly your tastes can adjust. Regardless, this is a quintessential Islay single malt that offers a robust and smoky experience. Its distinctive peat smoke and medicinal notes make it a polarizing yet beloved choice among whiskey enthusiasts. While it may be intense for beginners, its complexity and depth provide a rewarding experience for those who appreciate bold flavors. So there it is, folks. Bourbon and Scotch each have their unique characteristics, from ingredients and production processes to flavor profiles. Whether you prefer the sweet, rich flavors of bourbon or the diverse, complex notes of Scotch, there's something for everyone to enjoy. We've explored the differences and similarities between bourbon and Scotch. We've covered Jim Beam White Label and Maker's Mark for bourbon, and the Macallan 12 and Laphroaig 10 for Scotch. Each of these spirits offers a unique experience, and I encourage you to try them all. I want to hear from you. What's your favorite bourbon or Scotch? Have you tried any of the ones we mentioned today? Drop a comment below and let's chat. And join the party. Use the link in the video description below to join our community of whiskey enthusiasts. And don't forget to check out my other videos. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Cheers!